Hello, I'm Martin Gillet. I'm at Imperial College London, and I'm going to talk about the fatigue crack growth and cyclic crack tip plasticity in 304L stainless steel. Is this correct? Yep. Okay. At high delta K. So the motivation is that the pressurized water reactor fleet in the UK is in need of life extensions if we are to reach our net zero carbon targets by 2050, I believe. And a major limiting factor, closer. Okay, this is better. Sorry about that. And a major limiting factor on the lifetime of components in the primary cooling circuit is fatigue crack growth. However, so the thermal fatigue in this region leads to very high delta K factors on cracks that may appear, and the components there are also very thick. And so we need to develop a better understanding of these conditions if we are to give out safe life extensions. However, these conditions don't necessarily match the specimens and the conditions that we have in lab tests. And this is partly due to the way we test and the standards we use. So in this case, the ASTM standard restricts the size of the monotonic plastic zone to a quarter of the remaining ligament length throughout the test. And the goal, of course, here is to ensure small-scale yielding so that you can actually use K factors, but also to make sure that your measurement is not influenced by any plasticity effects, so that being ductile tearing and even getting close to plastic collapse. Now, it's stated in the documents that led to this standard that this requirement is not well adjusted to ductile metals. So we wanted to just test this out with a prototype test and see what we would get. So using a large compact tension specimen, which I'll refer to now as LCT, and various measurement methods, so DCPD for monitoring crack length, and then more traditional methods that you all know. We measured a crack rate at high delta K, ranging from 40 megapascal root squared meters to about a couple hundred. And on the side, a simulation which shows how there is significant plasticity. So even the use of a delta K here theoretically is potentially unsound, but bear with me, let's see what happens. The results were quite surprising. So the two prototype tests that were performed are shown in blue and red. Does this work? This works. Blue and red over here. And there's an initial notch effect here. So what is of note here is that the crack growth rate seems to agree very well with literature data in the low delta K predominantly elastic region, which is quite surprising given that everything seems to predict significant plasticity. The other thing that's interesting about this graph is that every point that is filled violates the criterion on a valid measurement. So in theory, we have a lot of data here that is influenced by plasticity effects, and yet there is good agreement throughout. I also plotted the failure assessment diagram for these two tests. And this diagram predicts the onset of ductile tearing around 100 megapascal root squared meters. So again, we have something pointing towards plasticity effects. And again, looking at the specimen fracture surface, something tells us otherwise. We have regular striations from start to finish and around the 100 megapascal root squared meter line. There is no notable change. The striations stay consistent. And more importantly, there is no real sign of plasticity effects. So at this stage, we wanted to investigate this further, and we decided to look into cyclic crack tip plasticity. Why that is? Well, partly because in the same documents that mentioned that the requirement was not well adjusted for ductile metals, it is explicitly stated that cyclic crack tip plasticity may control crack growth mechanisms in these conditions, and 304L happens to be a cyclic hardening material. The other thing is, at these high delta Ks, we expect to have reverse yielding at the crack tip. So there will be an area at the crack tip that actually yields at each cycle compressively, and gets a chance to cyclically harden. And we're even considering how close it might get to elastic shakedown, which may even restore conditions that allow for a K factor. So the first thing to do was to verify whether this was plausible to measure. So a quick simulation with a simple isotropic model showed that there was indeed a reverse yielding zone in this material at the crack tip for delta K initially of about 40 megapascal root squared meters. So on one side, we have a fatigue crack growth rate of the order of microns per cycle. And on the other side, we have a reverse yielding zone of the order of a few millimeters that reverse yields every cycle. So if you can actually reverse yield this zone multiple times before the crack even grows into this zone, you can really precondition the material head of the crack tip and change the way we'd calculate this with bulk material properties. So this made it look like it was plausible to observe. So we made a test plan, starting with some tensile tests to get the properties for this batch of 304L. Then cyclic uniaxial test to develop a combined hardening model that we can then use to predict what's happening in our LCT experiments. And then finally, another fatigue crack growth test, this time heavily monitored with some DIC methods. So a little bit about the uniaxial cyclic tests. So multiple strain ranges were tested. The 2% strain range was used to build and optimize a combined hardening model that is kinematic and cyclic hardening. And as you can see in the next slide, the model does predict stress at each cycle quite well. And this was optimized partly with a MATLAB code for the kinematic components, and then cyclic hardening components were optimized more manually in Abacus. So this is great if you use the data that you use to form the model to then use the model to predict that very same data. That's great, but if it doesn't work for other strain ranges, it's not very useful. So we used the same material parameters to predict a different test, and the prediction stayed quite good. So this was for a different strain range, and we predict the stress at each cycle quite well, and even the final yield locus in this case, which is a different cycle count, is also predicted quite well. It's not perfect, but it definitely seems adequate enough for what we want to achieve. Okay, so next up, the fatigue crack growth experiment. So this time we have 2 cameras at the front for 3D DIC and 1 camera at the back for 2D DIC. The 3D cameras want to focus on the crack tip to get a really good reading on the crack tip strain field, while the camera at the back simply gets a sort of whole picture of the LCC to see how close we are to plastic collapse as the crack grows. And then, of course, we have the usual DCPD crack length monitoring and then other traditional methods. And results so far are noisy, granted, but they seem to be adequate for a proof of concept. So here at the top is the new prediction using our material model that we've just built. And it agrees well enough with the DIC, though it's not perfect, and I can think of reasons why, but in the interest of time, I'll have to move over this. There's also a couple of things to take into account, which makes this measurement very difficult, is that the strain resolution for the DIC part of things is dependent on image resolution, on DIC facet parameters, but also the size of grains in this area is of the order of this sort of noise cloud. So it makes the measurement difficult. So at least this is somewhat what we expected, and we'll work with this for a proof of concept. But also the idea really is to how am I doing on time? Yeah, is to ensure that our model can predict this accurately at the surface, so that we can then gain insight in the through thickness in the bulk of the material, and really see what's happening in plane strain. Now, what was really interesting is that around cycle 100, where we have reached elastic shakedown, or at least we think so. Why do we think so? Firstly, because the strain field no longer changes from cycle to cycle. Secondly, because our potential drop measurement tells us that there has been no crack growth in this range. And thirdly, because we know from our cyclic uniaxial test that we can reach a stabilized state after only about 10 cycles. Yeah, so that's how we knew that we reached elastic shakedown at the crack tip. Now, so that from the strain field, we can extrapolate a stress field, and plotting this against an elastic K-field solution, we get a good agreement. This is very surprising given that we're at such high delta Ks where there is significant plasticity, and yet this agrees. And it's as the crack grows, this will get even more severe. We'll be at a point where you can, theoretically speaking, not really use a K factor nor even a delta J. So it's good to use stress, or at least a strain field, to compare, because that is based in reality. So this is something that's quite interesting, and I'll study how this evolves as the crack gets longer. So in terms of future work, I'm going to keep going on this fatigue crack growth test, and revise the model to get a better fit with the DIC data so that we can really use this to have a valid model to then predict what's happening inside of the specimen. I'm going to use this new combined hardening model to, with the DIC strain data, to sort of reproduce strain history and see how close we are to elastic shakedown and how hardened this material has actually gotten. And finally, I have a new simulation plan that will look at the transition from this early crack length, where you do get to cycle many times before the crack really grows into this new material, and then how that transitions to later on, where the crack is so long and the plastic zone is so large that you don't necessarily have the time to really reverse yield multiple times. But yes, so hopefully you now see the problem I'm trying to investigate. So where we have data that tells us that there is an agreement in high delta K and low delta K tests, and yet so many things point towards plasticity effects and invalid tests. You've now seen the plan I'm using to address this. In the process, a combined hardening model was developed, and the initial DIC strain field looks quite interesting, given that it globally agrees with the K fields that we're prescribing at these loads. Yep, that's everything. Thank you very much.